Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program. My name is Linda Fisher, and I am a JDC board member and a member of the Archive Committee. So nice to have you here. And we have an audience of people from more than 15 countries, which is quite amazing. So good morning, good evening, good middle of the night, good whatever. It's just nice to have you. So thank you to what promises to be an outstanding program. I hope everyone can hear me and see me. And it's going to be just an incredible presentation. The JDC Archives holds the records of JDC since its creation almost 105 years ago. As such, it's one of the most important repositories of Jewish history in the world. Visiting scholars from all over the world, as well as publishers, authors, journalists, people interested in their family backgrounds, all use our research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research. And now I'm excited to welcome our speaker for today, Rebecca Clifford, who is calling in from England. She's an associate professor of modern history at Swansea University in the United Kingdom. Dr. Clifford, who's originally from Canada, received a doctorate in modern history from the University of Oxford in 2008. Her chief research interests are 20th century European history, oral history, Holocaust history, and memory studies. Her latest book is incredible. It's called Survivors: Children's Lives After the Holocaust. And she's here today to share that research and that story with all of us. It's been nominated for a number of leading prizes in the field, including the prestigious Wingate Prize, the Wolfson History Prize, the Baillie Gifford Prize for nonfiction, and additionally, it was the Telegraph Book of the Year in 2020. The title of her lecture today will be Impossible Reconstructions: Families After the Holocaust. So our format will be as follows. Dr. Clifford will present for about 45 minutes, and that will be followed by a 15-minute of question and answer. You probably can tell by looking that you're on mute. We are going to keep you on mute. And if you have any questions, at the bottom is a chat box. Simply type your questions either when the presentation is over or during the research. And we hope to get to all of you. If not, we promise, and that's a promise, that someone from Archives or Dr. Clifford will get back to you later. Additionally, if you check the conversation Q&A box afterwards, it will put up a link where you can purchase Dr. Clifford's book through Yale at a discounted price. So that's something that we will all take advantage of, I hope. And now, Dr. Clifford, thank you for joining us. Welcome, and looking forward to hearing your lecture.
Thank you so much, Linda. Can everybody hear me okay? Linda, am I coming through clearly? Great. Hope that's true for the rest of you. I can't believe how many people are here tonight. So I'm really, really thrilled to speak to all of you. And I'm so grateful for the JDC Archives for inviting me to have this chance to talk to you tonight. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Bear with me for a second. I only have a few photographs on the screen, so I might sort of share it occasionally and not share it the rest of the time because it sort of reduces me to a very small box. But I'll start off because I think the photos are really wonderful to look at. And also because it's quite a long talk tonight, I've got my notes printed out on paper. So I have to keep sort of looking away from you at the notes, but I can't see you anyway. So hopefully that will not be too disconcerting for you. So the talk tonight is about family. So I'm saying tonight because here it's getting towards evening. It's about families after the Holocaust, and I want to start with a brief story. In December 1945, a care home for young child survivors of the Holocaust was set up in a country estate, Weir Courtney, in the little town of Lingfield in Surrey, which is in the south of England. So here's a picture of that country estate. The children who spent part of their post war childhoods in this home came to Britain on a scheme run by an aid organization called the Central British Fund. And that scheme was for what they called children of the camps, meaning, of course, child concentration camp survivors, although children who were not concentration camp survivors, but who were Holocaust survivors also came on that program. Now, to be eligible for that scheme, you had to be an orphan, but it was unclear in December 1945 which of the children at this orphanage might have still had a living parent. In the summer of 1946, the Weir Courtney children were amazed when a father and a mother turned up to claim one of their fellows, Litzy. Here's a picture of her, actually. She is the child who is second in on the right. So Litzy went home to live with these two people that she thought were her parents. The staff at the care home knew the truth of the situation, but the children didn't. And Litzy herself believed she was living with her parents until one day when she was in her late teens. In the midst of an argument with the man she thought was her father, she screamed, "I wish you were my father." And he said, "I'm not." He was actually her father's brother, and he had come to claim her and understood or believed, as was not atypical, that it would be an easier route forwards for her if he lied about the truth than if he told the truth. So she lived with this throughout her entire childhood, and she certainly wasn't the only one. But if we go back to for a minute to Weir Courtney, shortly after Litzy's uncle came to claim her, other parents, all mothers, began to trickle back into the lives of the Weir Courtney children. The first of these mothers found her children, who were two sisters living in the care home, in the autumn of 1946. But just think about this for a minute. The last of these mothers only showed up in 1952. The first of, sorry, so that was an extreme, sorry, the point I wanted to make there was that there was a very, very long wait for these children in a sort of space of suspended animation. Now, the Weir Courtney was a small care home. There were never more than 28 children who passed through its doors. And of those 28 children, 9 ended up having surviving mothers. Of those 9, two returned to live relatively settled lives with their mother. So this was the 2 sisters I mentioned before. 4 spent the rest of their childhoods going back and forth between care homes, not only this one, and living with mothers. And that went on until they were of the age of majority. And 3 never returned to live properly with their mothers again, or at least not until their childhoods were largely over. So I start with this little story of one small care home because it illustrates some important points about family reunification after the Holocaust. The first point is that those early years after the war's end were an agonizing period of uncertainty for child Holocaust survivors. Imagine living in that state where you're constantly braced to either learn about the death of your parents or holding out hope that they might still be alive. And that long wait was strung out over a period of years. So children had to maintain that conflicted emotional state, in some cases for much of the remainder of their early childhood. When surviving parents did turn up, those reunions were very rarely easy. And that's what I want to talk about today, especially because I think it is particularly challenging for us to accept. Our assumptions really intercede when we think about family reunions after the Holocaust. And I know I'm saying this, I'm speaking from the vantage point of a Holocaust historian. I've worked on this for the last dozen years, and still there were many things about writing this book that shocked me, and probably none more than this particular topic. And I had to ask myself, why was I so shocked by this? Why was I so surprised that it was so hard to be returned to surviving parents? And I think it's because there's a kind of, we've all encountered that cathartic scene in film or literature where families are reunited after the Holocaust and they're hugging and they're crying and it's supposed to be joyful. And it's so difficult to set this aside and focus on a darker picture. I think in a broader sense, the whole idea of family as being, the best place for a child to grow up is a very seductive one. We want to believe that for a child survivor of the Holocaust, the best possible outcome was to be reunited with a family member, especially when there were so many children who at the war's end found themselves with no relatives left alive at all. So the research I'm going to talk about today comes from this book, Survivors, which came out in Britain last summer and in the United States in September 2020. And it's my most recent book. And certainly in so many ways, the one I have enjoyed writing more than any other, and the one I've learned from more than anything else I've ever worked on. It's a book that looks at the post-war lives, of 100 very young child survivors. And it follows them through not just those immediate years and months and years after, 1945, but straight through the course of their lives right down to the present. It is a book full of emotive topics, and I really don't think there's any topic more emotive than the one we're talking about today. The truth is, as I discovered in writing this book, that family reunions could be among the most difficult and distressing experiences that a child survivor went through after the war. And in some cases, they were far more difficult and distressing than anything that happened to the child during the war. If we look with neutral eyes at the situation, it's not hard to see why. It's just that we don't normally look at family with neutral eyes because we have strong feelings about family. The reunified Jewish family was intensely fragile. Parents and children had often been apart for years. And the important thing to keep in mind is that the war had changed them, parents and children alike. They frequently didn't speak the same language anymore. And children, especially children who had been hidden during the Holocaust, which was the majority of children who survived, sometimes had new names. They had new identities, or new religious identities, new national identities. They might have had strong attachments to the families that hid them during the war. Frequently, they did. The youngest children might have had no memory of their parents at all. And so if they were returned to a living parent, they were effectively returned to a stranger. And of course, parents were changed too. They had been living in concentration camps, in forced or slaved labor situations, in hiding, living a dangerous existence, passing as Aryan, or living in the kind of deep recesses of the Soviet Union, starving. I mean, there were lots of ways to survive, but all of them could have really profound, obviously negative effects on a person. Many of these parents were in a state of total physical and emotional collapse by the liberation. And they had managed to survive, but they faced staggering poverty and ungenerous or just non-existent restitution policies. So they could, manage to survive, but come to find that they had no apartment anymore, no job to reclaim, no belongings. Economic instability and emotional fragility combined in many families to ensure that reunions between children and parents were fraught and sometimes disastrous. So in today's talk, I want to look at family reunion after the Holocaust and explore how aid agencies like the JDC and parents and children approach the issue. We'll have a look at a couple of case studies. I use these case studies only because both, first of all, they're fascinating. Second, one of them extensively was put together using the JDC archives. And thirdly, neither of them is in the book. So, if you do buy the book and read it, this is like bonus material. And they were both wonderful stories that actually originally were in the book, but as we edited it down, they got cut out for various reasons, just to do with the length of the book. I think they're both extraordinary stories, and there were many stories that I wanted to include that didn't make their way in. So it's nice to be able to present them in this form. Now, I'll be using both archival documents and oral history to talk about these stories today. And I suspect that most of you in the room today are not academic historians, but if you want to have a discussion about methodology, we can definitely do it in the questions. But before I tell you about these case studies, I should say a bit about the scale of the problem at the end of the Second World War. An estimated 150,000 Jewish children survived the Holocaust in continental Europe. There was an additional 30,000 estimated, that's an estimate compiled by the JDC shortly after the war. An additional 30,000 survived by fleeing into the Soviet Union, and some additional tens of thousands survived elsewhere through kinder transport schemes, for example. This is of an estimated 1.5 million children in the pre-war Jewish population. So, you know, it's a very tiny fraction of a whole generation that survived. In the early post-war years, so of this, you know, roughly 180,000 child survivors who were in continental Europe as those who were in the Soviet Union trickled back, 120,000, so really the vast majority, received financial support from the JDC. And of these, a sizable majority of 85,000 lived with at least one surviving parent or with relatives. So these are from the JDC's own post-war statistics. So we're not talking about a negligible number of families that were affected. And these surviving children found themselves part of a massive effort involving care agencies and the United Nations and governments and other institutions to reconstruct Europe's Jewish families after the Holocaust. Those efforts were driven, and this is important to keep in mind because it really shapes what happens to children. They were driven by practical concerns, but they were also driven by ideological ones. The power of that emergent post-war vision of the family, especially in Western Europe, as a kind of, you know, a potential bulwark against the return of fascism or indeed the threat of communism, as the base unit of a renewed democracy. That's something that's been well studied by historians. So you'll be familiar with the, you know, the baby boom and the expansion of European welfare states and the promotion of the so-called nuclear family, etc. Now, this was common to some degree across Western European states. And states and humanitarian aid organizations shared this vision of the family as a unit that could act against collectivist impulses. This post-war embrace of the family was laced with fears of the opposite, that the war had actually destroyed families. This is not just Jewish families, but much more broadly. And that European civilization could not be rebuilt until families were rebuilt. As the wonderful historian Tara Zara writes, there was a powerful shared post-war perception that if Nazism had sought to destroy the family, its restoration would be Europe's salvation. So the post-war reconstruction of families in a broad sense was bound up in Reconstruction more generally. But Zara reminds us that this wasn't just about a return to some kind of pre-war normality. This was really a moment in which the basic ideals of family and of childhood were being reinvented. There was a whole new emerging world of experts, social workers using the casework model, psychologists and youth workers who were working at the coalface of this intersection between mental health, the family, and citizenship. This process was also really strongly informed by new developments in psychoanalysis, and particularly the growth of child psychoanalysis. The work of Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham on evacuated children in Britain was very well known, certainly to a British general public, as was their, at the time, very novel assertion that for a child, separation from the family was more harmful than the risk of falling bombs. And actually, if I can just very briefly go back to this lovely picture of Weir Courtney. Weir Courtney was actually, it was created under kind of the, I'm trying to find the right term for this. Anna Freud was a patron, basically, and she would help to organize the creation of this care home. And actually, it's such a wonderful, interesting story that although I do touch on it a little bit in Survivors, I'm writing my next book just on this case because it's so interesting to see how these children, this little group of children, end up becoming very important to the development of child psychoanalysis. So watch this space within a few years. I hope I'll have that book ready. John Bowlby, whose work was likewise well known to a general public in Britain, argued even more forcefully that maternal deprivation would turn children into what he said affectionless characters doomed to crippled emotional relationships. So all this is to say that there was a really strong push driven by changes in the field of mental health and reinforced by states and institution and aid agencies towards the reconstitution of families as a central part of post-war reconstruction. Let me actually, just for a minute, I'll stop sharing the screen just because I've only have a couple more pictures to show you. But there was really quite a big gulf between this ideological vision of the family and the on the ground reality of family reunification, as we're going to see. Those aid agencies whose work it was to reunite families walked a difficult and sometimes contradictory line between subscribing to that ideal, putting family reunification first, and fearing its repercussions. Agency care workers themselves were, of course, they weren't operating in a vacuum, and they were informed by a certain prejudice. And this is something I didn't understand well until I was working on this book, I think. A certain prejudice towards concentration camp survivors and towards survivors, adult survivors of the Holocaust more generally. Keeping in mind that in the immediate post-war popular imagination, adult displaced persons and concentration camp survivors were often portrayed as relying on charity handouts, running the black market, and in general having had their moral compasses destroyed by their time in the camps. In other words, they were often presented as fundamentally damaged by Nazism. In Britain, newspaper articles and letters to the editor opined that survivors were likely to be violent or incapable of unlearning the skills of deception that had kept them alive in the camps. Social workers from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration worried that camp survivor parents wouldn't be up to the task of rebuilding families, and they were particularly worried about mothers, who they assumed must have lost their feminine qualities. I think it's really difficult from a 21st century vantage point where we honor survivors to recognize how deeply survivors were the objects of fear and suspicion in the early post-war years. And this was true for adult survivors. It was true for child survivors too, but children were considered more redeemable, which is not something I want to talk about in the talk today, but I do write about it in the book if that interests you. There's a whole chapter on it. Sorry, excuse me while I have a drink. Some child advocates went as far as to argue that children would be better off if they were not returned to survivor parents, and parents should resist claiming them. There are also some very practical issues that negatively influenced family reunification. The attitude that children would have a more secure material life if they were not returned to their parents was shared by care workers and by many parents and even by some children. Indeed, because survivor parents would be expected to resume financial obligations to their children if they were reunited, sometimes both parents and children sought to conceal the fact that parents had survived from care agencies. As well, because a lot of post-war immigration schemes were open only to children, parents and children sometimes worked to hide the fact that a parent had survived so that the child could get out of Europe, especially if they found themselves living in a displaced persons camp. For example, Canadian aid agencies recorded in the early post-war period that some children who had immigrated on their war orphans scheme. So I showed you the picture of Weir Courtney and talked a little bit about the British scheme. And Canada had a very similar parallel scheme modeled in some ways on the British one. So they feared, the Canadian officers with the Canadian scheme feared that some of their war orphans had, quote, succeeded in concealing the fact that they were not fully orphaned. And actually quite a good number of those who ended up being brought to Canada on the scheme were indeed not fully orphaned and had worked to hide that fact. What I actually kind of find interesting about this case is that they really point out how far even some very little children had some agency in the process. It's not clear how far parents might have encouraged their children to conceal the fact that a parent was still alive, or if the children chose to do it themselves, but it happened frequently. The thing I think you might see today is that children's agency is the most difficult force to chart in this drama of family reunification, at least if you only draw from archival documents. So, with this in mind, I'd like to now turn to these two case studies. We're going to look at one family where the daughter was reunited with her parents, and one where the parent and child never managed to resume their family life. Their stories can be told with archival documents up to a point, but to understand the afterlives of these attempts at family reconstruction, I'm also going to draw on oral history. So let me just go back and share my screen again. Whoops. There we go. So I'd like to start with the case of Joan, who you can see here both with her cute little braids up on her head on the right, and then the left side photo, she's the littlest one standing at the front of the picture. So Joan was born Fanny in Brussels in February 1940. Her father was taken when the Germans invaded in May, but he managed to escape and survived the war first by hiding in Vichy, France, which was not all that safe a place. And then remarkably, and I don't quite understand fully how, managed to make it to Britain in 1943, where he actually ended up joining the forces. Joan's mother managed to escape across the Pyrenees with Joan and her older half-sister. And it was there, once they made it across into Spain, that the American Friends Service Committee, working together with the United States Commission on the Care of European Children, brought the two children only. So their mother stayed, I'm trying to remember the trajectory. They went through Spain to Portugal. The mother stayed behind in continental Europe, and the children were brought from Portugal on a ship to the United States in the spring of 1943. There were not many children who managed to escape this way, but there were a small handful. After a brief stay in an orphanage, Joan was placed with a well-off foster family in Philadelphia. She was 3 years old. After 4 years with her foster family in Philadelphia, Joan and her sister were sent back to live with their parents in 1947. Sorry, I should clarify that Joan's sister was not with her in the foster family. And I think it's also worth really emphasizing that she was such a small child when she was placed with her foster family that she really had no memory of her parents or indeed her life before living with the foster family. And later would tell me in an interview that she really thought they were her parents. How could she know otherwise? She was only 3. So, but here at the age of 7.5, so still a very young child, she was sent back to live with her birth parents. That was 1947, and her parents were trying to reestablish their lives, and they had managed to both make it, both survive and make it to London, England. Now we can reconstruct some of Joan's story from archival documents, especially from the collection on the American Friends Service Committee that's held at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And that collection gives a rather rosy picture of this family reunion based on positive and quite judgmental, but in a positive way, assessments of both the foster and the birth families. The agency interviewed Joan's mother in August 1944, and they noted that she, quote, makes an excellent impression. Although obviously very much moved by the news of her children, she was restrained and intelligent in speaking of them. So obviously the right kind of mother. And you'll see how judgmental the agencies can be when we get to the second case. The notes in her file were equally praiseworthy of her foster family, noting, quote, that this little girl walked into the arms of her foster parents and has a very secure place in their affections. The foster parents are middle-class people living in a suburban community and having fine standards of living. And one does see frequently in aid agency files this connection between social class and the idea that a family is a good family. The case notes record that in the news that in 1947, Joan was quite upset to learn that she would be returned to her birth parents. Although she calmed down somewhat, it said, after the initial shock. From the agency's perspective, there was no reason to believe that this wouldn't be a fairly smooth reunification. because Joan had been in a loving home and she was returned to a loving birth mother. So the situation seemed to fit the ideal. And I need to stress that from the perspective of the agencies, that was actually quite rare. But if we take the documents we can find in the archives and then put them together with Joan's oral testimony, it gives us a rather less rosy picture, which probably won't surprise you, of family reunification. It's really one then that we see where Joan is feels that she's caught in a kind of tangled web between her foster family and her birth family. And that's quite a common experience for many child survivors who have spent a long period of time living with a foster family. So I interviewed Joan in, I think it was the autumn of 2015. So this, what I'm going to tell you about her story now, comes from that interview. Joan recalled that she really didn't understand that her foster parents weren't her real parents. She was taken by plane to England, and she remembers meeting her mother, her birth mother. She had no memory of her birth mother, and they had no common language anymore. Because her birth parents hadn't really learned to speak English yet. I think her father was coming on okay with the English because he'd been in the forces, but her mother wasn't there yet. She remembers her mother trying to hug her and thinking that and this is, I'm quoting from her, I just didn't want them to touch me. It was a nightmare, you know. It was like being abducted as far as I'm concerned. Part of what was really destabilizing for Joan, who after all was a really very small child. I mean, I say that thinking she's 7.5 at this time, and my own daughter is eight, sorry, just turned 8 recently. And so I'm kind of thinking about what you can and can't understand at that age, and you're limited in many ways. So part of what was really hard for Joan was this sudden, unexpected descent in social class. She had lived with a really wealthy family in Philadelphia. They had a large home and spacious lawns. But her birth parents, although they had been well off before the war, were living in a little flat above a shop with a cold water sink and an outdoor toilet in what she calls a slum somewhere near King's Cross Station in London. It wasn't really the poverty that bothered her so much as her parents' embarrassment about it. Especially, she remembers this kind of awful moment where her foster family packed her luggage for her to return, and they packed all her clothes and things into trunks. And so she arrived with all these trunks, and she remembers her parents with this sort of discomfort, thinking, where are we even going to put all this stuff? They were living in a tiny flat, a tiny apartment. She remembers also that although her father seemed to understand that she herself had gone through her own traumatic experiences during the war, if you think about the fact that she was, sent alone to the United States and had to adapt to living with a new family and then found herself ripped away from that family. Her mother, quote, only saw that I was her baby. I'd gone away and I'd come back. Why didn't I just love her? So part of the agony in trying to rebuild was her mother's lack of understanding that Joan's own trajectory had deeply changed her. So while Joan was reunited with her family, it wasn't a comfortable relationship. She ended up going back and forth between England and America, between her birth parents and her foster parents throughout the remainder of her childhood. And she remembers that no matter where she was, she felt as if the other household was being negatively judged. In her words, as an adult trying to make sense of that whole experience, she recalls that, quote, I was sort of being told that who I am is no good, as her birth mother always sort of looked askance at her foster parents and the reverse. The difficulties she experienced returning to her family were part of a common experience for many child survivors. Joan's case reminds us that when there were multiple claims on a child during the war period, this could stretch into the post-war years with some very serious consequences. The confusion and guilt caused by 2 different families claiming her made this a difficult reunion, even if it was a successful one in terms of how the agency thought of it. So that's just a really little bit about Joan, and now I want to tell you about Vic, who you see in this picture. He is the very cute little boy on the right-hand side. So Vic was born in April 1941 in Berlin. So at the war's end, he was only 4 years old. He was a very small child. His father was taken away 2 weeks after he was born, and his mother was working as a slave laborer in a rubber factory. This was in Berlin. He came down with an ear infection when he was roughly a year old, and he was put in the Berlin Jewish hospital. And from there, he was deported without his mother's knowledge to the Theresienstadt ghetto camp. He survived the camp, even though he was just a 1-year-old, an infant deportee. He survived thanks to the attention and sacrifice of the adults who ran the camp's various children's wards. After the war, he was one of a cohort of 300 children who came to Britain on this special scheme that I talked a little bit about at the beginning. Now, most of those children who came in that first cohort were older, but Vic was among this small group of children who ended up going to live in Weir Courtney. So staff at Weir Courtney learned in, sorry, just so you, that's the house I showed you at the beginning. So staff at Weir Courtney learned in 1946 that Vic's mother was still alive and living in Austria. But although some attempts at reunion were made, Vic he didn't see his mother again until his late teens. Now, I know about this early part of Vic's story thanks to the JDC archives, which has a really remarkable collection, just in and around Vic's case, quite a lot of really remarkable documents. So those documents offer suggestions as to why reunion between Vic and his mother proved so challenging. The files show that Vic's mother, Margot, was working as an interpreter for United States troops in Austria, and she was boarding in a hotel, kind of hotel where, women who were doing various clerical jobs for the troops were boarded. Lots of single women, basically working for the forces. These documents also show that Vic's grandmother, so that's Margot's mother, his mother's mother, had survived, but she was living in Sweden and herself was financially struggling to the extent that she couldn't provide her daughter with anything. So here we have a family, this is quite typical after the Holocaust, a family really struggling financially and separated across the 3 generations. It's also worth noting that Margot had had 2 additional children with a different father, and both of these children were boarded out with a foster family. It's important because, as you'll see in a minute, the staff at the care home quite looked askance at this. So in comparison with the Friends documents that looked at Joan's mother and said, well, she's a really good mother, this did not happen in Vic's case. And some of the judgments are quite unfair. We'll get there in a minute. In the fall of 1946, Margot wrote to the Austrian Red Cross looking for Vic. When she located him in England, she wrote a letter that's in the JDC archives, but it was addressed to the British Jewish Refugee Committee, explaining that, quote, I couldn't write to you before because I didn't have plans for our future. And she asked them to send Vic to Berlin, where she claimed to be living with a friend. But the agencies involved, and this included the matron of the care home at Weir Courtney, were suspicious that if they sent Vic back to his mother, she'd end up placing him in foster care because she had done so with her other 2 children. A few months later, her own mother, so this is Vic's grandmother, actually wrote to the JDC and suggested that really it probably wouldn't be wise to return Vic to Germany, and asked maybe if he wouldn't be better off being sent to Palestine instead. The archives recorded that in June 1947, there was official permission granted to repatriate Vic to Austria, but the permission closed without him having been sent. Now, if we turn away from the documents we can find in the JDC archives and look at the archives of Weir Courtney, the records we have from the care home, which I should mention are not in one location, but some part of them are at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Some of them are at the Wiener Library in London, and some of them are in the collection of the University of Southampton, and I think there might be more in the London Metropolitan Archives as well, which are copies. Now I told you that and I lost my place. Oh, so if we turn and we look at what the staff at the care home thought about this situation, we'll find quite a different story. Staff at Weir Courtney clearly felt it was their duty to protect Vic from his own mother, and they were suspicious of her motivations and her character. In March 1952, when Vic was 11 years old already, the matron of the care home, Alice Goldberger, wrote rather piercingly, and I'm going to quote from her report. She wrote, Vic has got a mother who's in Austria or Germany. We heard last of her that she is a waitress. She has several children from different men. That's not true, but that is what she thought. Very unfortunately for Vic, she wrote to him and promised to take him to her. And we started to teach him German because he'd forgotten it, because we expected the call for him to have to go. Vic was bewildered at the time, talking about his little sister and his mummy, because of course he has no memory of her. One day, a new uncle wrote to Vic, promising to take him and his mummy to America. I kept this letter from him because I didn't want to upset the child and bring new conflicts to him. It looked as if Vic's mother had met a young American soldier with whom she had made all kinds of future plans. That was the last we heard directly from her. So, was Vic's mother's situation too financially precarious for her to be able to reclaim her child? The holdings in the JDC archive certainly suggest that, but the Weir Courtney records, well, very judgmental and in places factually inaccurate, suggests a more complex situation. And if we want to further complexify it, we can turn to oral history. We're privileged in Vic's case to actually have testimony from his mother that was recorded by psychologist Sarah Moskowitz in 1978. Margot recalled in this interview that in the immediate post war years, her circumstances had made it impossible to keep a child with her. So I'm quoting here now from that interview. For a while, she said, I thought to take him and I wrote to Miss Goldberger, but what could I do with him? He didn't speak German. I was still ducked under, which she means is she was still passing as Aryan. I decided I couldn't take him. I had nothing, absolutely nothing. I had the two other children boarded out. I was living in the hotel with the other girls. It was no place to take a child to. The people who had the other two children couldn't take another. I wrote to Miss Goldberger and asked her if she could keep him. Things didn't get any better with me, living from hand to mouth. But I was very torn. Here's a child who's been taken away by force, and all of a sudden I really couldn't have him back. But the life he had there was better than the life I could have given him in Austria. So that explanation corresponds with what we've seen more or less in the JDC archives. Sorry, but other details in Margot's narrative suggest a further layer of complexity. She tells a story that she remarried and immigrated to the US in the early 1950s, around the time that in the care home notes it says that there's a new uncle writing a letter to Vic. So she established a new life in the United States, but she didn't ask Vic to join her at that point. She did, however, refuse to agree to a potential adoption that the care home tried to arrange for Vic when he was 12 years old. So she felt unable to care for him, but she equally didn't want him to go to any other family. This, again, was a common enough trajectory for many child survivors whose families didn't feel that they could care for them, but also didn't want to lose them to the family. Vic's own explanation of the story was very different. I interviewed him in July 2017, and he recalled the terrible tension between the frequent promises that he had that he would go and live with his mother and the constant disappointment when these promises didn't materialize. If Vic's mother's story seeks to justify her choice, Vic's own story reflects the confusion of a grown person who was then a child who still doesn't really understand what went wrong. So here I'm quoting from his interview. In 1947, I heard that my mother was still alive and living in Germany or Austria, one of those. But nothing ever really came of it. It was kind of under the rug. And then in the early 1950s, it rose up again. I was all excited. I was going to go to Germany to be with her. And I started trying to learn German again because I'd forgotten that. Then that fell apart. Nothing came of that. Then in May 1958, I got a letter from my mother. She was in the United States. I had a brother and a sister. She was married to a man who had a steady job, and she was telling me to come, and I wanted to go. He remembered that he had fond dreams about what it would be like to be reunited with his mother. But actually what happened is the care home staff tried to stop him from going, really worried about what would happen. And he was towards the end of his teens and was, feeling a little rebellious maybe. And so he said, "No, I'm gonna go." So he did go. And he recalls that the reunion itself was disorienting and strange. His mother lived with her two younger children and her husband in a remote town in the mountains in Washington state. So he effectively found himself isolated with complete strangers. He says, "It didn't take me long to realize that I might not have done the right thing. It wasn't what I thought it would be like. It wasn't all peaches and cream. I had visited school friends who had regular families, so I thought I knew what it would be like. But when I got there, nobody really said anything to me, and I felt strange. My mother wasn't kind at all, and there were times when I wondered what I was doing there. It wasn't until years later that I found out from my sister that she and my brother were hoping I'd get them out of there." Vic only managed to live with his family for a few months before he ended up fleeing that home and joining the army. So, in conclusion, I actually think I've written army, but I think it was the Air Force that Vic joined. So he joined the military. This is the US military, and he still lives in that area. In conclusion, these stories suggest, and they're really only two of many that I could have told, they suggest that rebuilding a relationship with a survivor parent could be a minefield for children who were themselves survivors. For all of the parties involved, aid agencies, parents, and children, the dream of that ideal family loomed large, but the reality was often material and emotional insecurity. Joan and Vic's stories represent trajectories that many child survivors will recognize. They serve as examples of why families face such enormous challenges when they manage to reunite. I also hope you'll see that these stories flag up the potential that comes with combining what you can find in the archives with later oral history. Archival holdings of aid agencies like the JDC can show us a lot of the early mechanics of family reunion and can suggest some of the complexities of the process, even if they leave us guessing sometimes about individual motivations. But oral history is important to keep in mind. It doesn't give us the child's experience. It gives us the adult's perspective on the childhood experience. It doesn't allow us to directly understand a child's thoughts or emotions. But what it sheds light on here is the long-term consequences of post-war family rebuilding, highlighting the impacts of broken child-parent relationships, not just over the course of childhoods, but over the course of entire lives. In studying family reunions after the Holocaust, we come face to face with the bald reality of what the European Jewish family looked like as a social unit in the wake of the genocide. It's a jarring picture of the long reach of destruction into the most intimate of spheres, the home and its inhabitants. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a really informative and emotional presentation. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. Some of the questions have been answered already as you've been chatting, but we do have one from Judith Heron. Do you discuss the repatriation of Polish children taken by Russia for re-Germanization?
No, that's a great question, but I don't. But I think there are quite a number of really good books on that topic, actually. It just wasn't one that came up with any of the children in the study. Thank you for your question, though.
I have a question. From personal experience, I have a friend who is a child of survivors, and she experiences a lot of survivor's guilt because her parents lost previous children in the camps. She was born after they were liberated.
Yeah.
Did you do any research as far as that's concerned, and can you shed any light on that?
I mean, so the book itself looks at this group of 100 children all through the 7 decades of their lives after the war, right straight through to the present. And a good chunk of them, I mean, I used to know off the top of my head. I think it's about 30% of the 100 kids in the book, so 30, end up being returned to at least one survivor parent and sometimes both. So that question of not just of the issue of survivor guilt, but the kind of psychological complexity of the relationship with survivor parents. It's really a thread that goes through the entire book. And as you say, that issue of survivor guilt comes in, but it's far more nuanced than that. In the later chapters, if you read the book, you'll find that really a lot of emotions come out for child survivors around kind of important life moments. And so sometimes that comes out when their own children are born and they're thinking about what happened to them when they were children. And sometimes I've got a wonderful story I tell in the book. There's a couple of them actually about how sometimes it makes them feel a little rebellious against their own parents. And sometimes they do things like their parents say, well, I don't want you to use that name for your child. And so they do it anyway. Or like there's a funny like complexity that comes out of that very intense relationship with a survivor parent that has both guilt in it and a need to rebel. And sometimes there's this complex dynamic where there's a parent survivor and a child survivor, and the parent is constantly talking about what they went through during the Holocaust. And the child also went through something during the Holocaust, but they never are listened to in the same way. And so sometimes it's this awful process of having to re-listen to your parents' pain. And what comes up a lot is it's a kind of aspect of survivor guilt, I suppose, that they forget it. So there's a few accounts in the book of a child survivor who says in an interview, God, my dad would never stop talking about all the camps he was in, but I forgot it. I couldn't hold the information in my brain. Like to this day, I just couldn't tell you. And that happens quite frequently, that there's a really, really complex dynamic between the survivor child and survivor parent. So the
We're
answer is
comparing
yes.
the ones that perished to the ones that survived too. I know that's part of
Yeah,
your study.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, we're going to move on to some more questions. Can you see me when this is placed in front of me? These questions?
I see you.
Okay.
I don't see the questions, but you I see.
Okay, so Beverly Chalmers, in my book, Betrayed Child Sex Abuse and the Holocaust, which was published in 2020, I came across a number of stories of children reunited with families and later sexually abused. Did you find that to be true in your research?
I thanks, Beverly. I'm sure we've met actually at a conference, and I'm sure I've heard you give a wonderful presentation before. So thanks so much for that question. Um, in the book, there are a couple of cases of children who were sexually abused during, like, by foster families, or well, they were staying with foster families during the war. There isn't in this particular sample any children who were sexually abused after by their own families or by their own relatives. However, one of the themes that does come back in the chapter where I look at family reunions is that there's quite a number who went back to physically violent parents. I mean, quite more than you would, well, maybe it is what we would think, but there's certainly a large number who go back to these parents who are strangers, really, only to find that their parents have become physically abusive. And this happens to a certain extent in Vic's case. Actually, I didn't talk about it today because it seemed like a complex a complex issue, but it happens to many of the children in the book. And so I think there is something there. Of course, these are, not to excuse violence against children in any way, but these are traumatized parents. But I do remember actually looking at the sample and thinking, okay, it's 100 children. It's not necessarily representative, but I'm not convinced that there's any more violence against children in this group than you might find in the population broadly. So I don't want to say that there's particularly a strain of violence in survivor parents. I think we'd probably find that in the general population as well.
Thank you. There's a question from Miriam Scharf. How many of these kids went on to live in Israel, or Palestine as it was called then?
In a way I cannot answer that question because I think we will never know. There were many routes for ending up in Palestine and then Israel. So of the children in the book, there's many of them who end up living in first, and some of them make it to Palestine, some go after the creation of the state of Israel. And there's many more whose stories I don't look at directly, but who I kind of encounter in the archives, who try to make it to Palestine, especially those in displaced person camps, and end up in internment camps on Cyprus, which is definitely, I'm hoping someone will write a book about that one day, because I hadn't really understood that that was when Palestine was still the British mandate, that many child survivors ended up actually being interned in camps on Cyprus, sometimes for quite a long time.
Right.
Of the children in the book, the ones who make it to Israel generally do, and it's mostly Israel, it's kind of after the end of the British mandate, mostly do because they've got a surviving relative there. And again, that's, I mean, the story from that point on looks rather similar to the stories I've told today. It's a rocky experience being reunited with relatives.
Here's the question. Tell us a success from Ruth Kirshner. Can you briefly tell us the story of a successful happily ever after reunion?
Gonna have to rack my brains here.
Oh no.
Was there one? Was there one? Were there any? No. As in, I can't think of one off the top of my head. There wasn't one that was straightforwardly a success. They were all, I mean, I would say the one I've told you about, Joan, today, is probably one of the most successful ones, in the sense that, you know, it was really hard and she went back and forth for years, but in the end, she loved her parents and loved her foster parents, and, you know, just turned out a fabulous person. And I think she would probably say it's about the most successful of the stories. But one of the things that I found really shocking working on this book was that the children who end up spending the rest of their childhoods in care homes like Weir Courtney, and lots of the kids in Weir Courtney end up spending the rest, like they live there till they're 18. It goes through a series of different homes, but it's effectively the same place. They have the much more happy childhoods. That, I think, is quite hard for us to accept. It was hard for me to accept. I can tell you many cases of happy childhoods spent in care homes, but I struggle to tell you a happy one with children returned to their families.
Is Weir Courtney still standing?
As a building, yeah, it's still there. I've never been because it's a private home now. So they were in that. What never changed for the Weir Courtney children was some of the children stayed the same throughout. And then the matron, Alice Goldberger, she was with them until they grew up. So they lived in Weir Courtney, and then eventually they moved a little closer to London, but they still think of themselves as brothers and sisters. They're a very important group to each other.
So you had mentioned Anna Freud. Jacqueline Adams wants to know, what were some of the ideas that Dr. Freud had about the children's home?
Well, that's a great question. And that actually is the topic of my next book. So it's something I'm thinking about and working on a lot. Anna Freud, part of the reason she took such a deep interest in these children was because she wanted to study them. Because so much of child psychoanalytic thinking at the time had to do with the mother-child relationship. And so she really wanted to see what happened to children who had never had contact with their mothers. It was part of the reason why she kept a very close relationship with this care home. Now, she ended up writing a paper. So it's a little confusing. When the children arrived in Britain, all the children went to this, there was a reception camp up in the Lake District at Windermere. All the children went to the Windermere camp. And then the very, very youngest children, there were 6 toddlers. They were taken to a kind of special care home just for the 6 of them. And then the children who were between 4 and 10 went to Weir Courtney. And the older children who were, you know, kind of preteens and teenagers went to various hostels all over the country. So the youngest group of all those 6 toddlers, Anna Freud set up a system so that they were directly observed every day, and there were extensive notes taken on their behavior. And she wrote a study about that was published in 1951. And that study, to my surprise, actually, in writing Survivors, that study is still a core, like it's mentioned in every child developmental psychology textbook you pick up. So it was a very important study, and that is something I'm going to be looking at in the next book. What happens and why the children don't see their own experiences really reflected in that study.
Thank you. We have a question from Enid Eckstein. Some French writers say that the role of the Joint and the United Nations RRA was cultural imperialism. Do you have any thought about that?
It's yes. I have a lovely colleague in Paris, Laura Hobson Farr, who writes about that extensively. I almost feel like I'd love to turn that question over to her. Um, you do see some really interesting, disturbing, I think, from our current vantage point, things that go on when you look at less so in the JDC archives, but more in the archives of the OZE, which was one of the major aid organizations in France. That there was a well, first of all, that as soon as the JDC started to remove funding, that it put the OZE in a terrible position where they kind of, at first they had said, we want to hold on to these children. We want to treat them like a family. We want to keep them in the care homes and they can grow up together. But when the JDC started to pull back its funding in 1947-48, suddenly the OZE didn't have the funding to care for the children. So they started to think, oh, maybe we better find some families for these children really quickly. And what you see, and so my colleague Lori writes about this so beautifully, is that you kind of get rich American tourists basically coming and picking up some kids. Like from our current vantage point, it's absolutely shocking. So some of the children remember that they kind of had to put on a show when some wealthy Americans rocked up in their fancy cars, that they'd kind of come and like get their pretty dresses on and do a little dance, and then maybe some of them would go home with some Americans. So this sort of thing did happen. That's not the kind of broad cultural imperialism, but down to the nitty gritty of a child's life that did happen.
Thank you. We have a question from Professor Art Shostak, and it's an interesting one. Did boys or girls have more success in this matter? Was there a gender difference in making the most of the situation?
That is such a wonderful question, and I don't know the answer to that one. There are lots of points around that I do mark up where there's a gender difference in experience in the book, but in terms of being returned to families, I'm not sure that I could say I see an obvious difference for boys and girls. Um, I'm gonna have to. I love that question, and so I'm gonna think about that question, and I'm gonna get back to you on that one because I love the thought that maybe there is something there that I haven't. That's been right in front of my face and I haven't seen it.
Okay,
So
so
thank you.
we do have so many questions. You
Mm.
have really opened up our minds to think
Uh-oh.
and to. So I will say we're going to answer just a few more questions in the interest of time, but can we keep this on the question and answer chat with the understanding that either Rebecca or Archives will get back to all of you to answer the question? Okay,
Yes.
so great. So we'll cover just a few more as it's after 12 o'clock here, and I don't know what it is, middle of the night, wherever you all are. So thank you. But so let's real quickly just cover a couple more. You had mentioned the care facility in England. Do you cover in your book care homes in other countries such as France or
Yes.
Belgium, or
Yes.
you do? Okay.
Lots of countries. I mean, I follow the children through whatever trajectories they go through. So I think there's quite a lot of information about France, and I do talk a lot about France in the book. Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, should be able, obviously the displaced person camps. And there's quite a lot there about the United States as well, because what I do, so every child in the book, there were some like rules about who got in the book basically. They had to be born between 1935 and 1944. I know I haven't explained in today's talk why, because I usually talk about that in a different talk, but I was really motivated by the question of what happens how you tell the story of who you are when you don't know where you come from. So I wanted to have only fairly young child survivors who really didn't have any pre-war memories and possibly didn't have very clear wartime memories, but they had something. And then at the end of the war, what they didn't have is what most of us have and take for granted. It's that social world of memory that helps you put your like fragmentary childhood memories together. Um, in the middle of telling you this, I totally lost the train of my own thought. Oh, right. So they had to be fairly young because I didn't want them to have really clear memories of the war period. They also, all the children in the book emigrated out of Europe. So you'll find that, they basically come from every European country and they move through many European countries, but ultimately they all end up leaving Europe. So they are in the United States and Canada and Britain and Australia and South Africa. And I mean, they end up in the Anglo-American world.
Thank you. So we're going to take, there's just so many questions, Rebecca, and that's fabulous. I'm going to just take these four. And again, promise all of you participants, we will, if we possible, get back to you either through the JDC or through Rebecca directly. And as a reminder, her book is available and it's listed through a link on the chat. And there it is. Yeah.
And here it is.
And
it's got a great cover.
Great cover. So Karen Balcom, could you speak a bit more about children who were adopted into new families without a connection to their first family and some of the places they ended up geographically? She goes on to say, I'm asking this question through the prism of US records about the desire for US families to adopt what they call war orphans.
Yeah, okay. So the answer is yes, I could say loads to that. Probably not in like 2 minutes. For that one, you might have to look at the book because, as I said, so all the children in the book end up emigrating out of Europe. And so some of them go on dedicated schemes for, as you say, war orphans. So Canada has a scheme, Britain has a scheme, South Africa and Australia have these dedicated schemes. And then, of course, after 1948, the United States has the DP Act. So there's a huge number of kids who come after that point. Okay. And many of those kids end up living with adoptive or foster families. And it's almost like a too big an issue to start to talk about because it's a huge component of the book. That relationship with adoptive families isn't necessarily any easier than it is with biological families. It can be really fraught, especially because, to be fair to adoptive families, they often don't really know anything about the Holocaust. So they've got these, their children start asking questions. Like in the book, I look at how really when these children start to enter their teenage years, they start to ask questions. Sometimes the questions can be family destroying. Like the one I started with at the beginning with Litzy, who's having a fight with her father, and she says, "I wish you weren't my father." And finally he says, "You know what, I'm not." So that's not an atypical experience. I've got a wonderful some stories were so evocative for me that they're kind of in the book more than, like, not all 100 children have their stories forcefully in the book. That would be overwhelming for the reader. So there's kind of some stars, I guess. And one of the stars whose story I talk about a lot is a man named Jackie Y. He actually is also at Weir Courtney, but he doesn't remember it very much at all. He ends up being adopted when he's quite young, and he doesn't know he's adopted. He thinks his parents are his parents. And he's at school one day, and when he's about 10, and somebody in the schoolyard says, "Oh, you're adopted." So he goes home and he says, "Is this true?" And his parents say, "Yes, it is. We were hoping you wouldn't find out." And he's like, "It's okay. I love you. You're my parents." And that's okay. But then about 5 years later, his grandmother, obviously adoptive grandmother, says, "Oh, well, you weren't born in this country." That one he finds much harder because he just thinks he's a typical East London Jewish kid. So then he goes to his parents and he says, "What's this about me being born in Austria?" And his parents, then they don't really want to go there anymore. They're kind of like, "Oh," his mother says, "Don't raise that. It upsets your dad a lot. Let's just forget about it." And the whole time he's being plagued by this dream of a lovely, I want to say, let me show it to you, of a lovely house in the countryside with a long sloping garden that goes down to a racehorse track. And he's dreaming about it. And he says to his parents, "What is this dream?" And his mom sort of says, like, "Oh, yeah, everybody has dreams like that." And finally, when he goes to get married, and because his wife to be is Jewish and he's Jewish, and they want to get married in the shul. So they go to the shul. This is in London, and the secretary wants them both to prove that they're Jewish. And his adopted mother says, well, you're just going to have to take my word for it. And the secretary says, I can't, I need proof. And she says, fine, I've got something in the safety deposit box. I'm going to go get it. So Jackie's thinking, well, what is going on here? So his mother goes to the safety deposit box, comes back with a little piece of paper and gives it to the secretary. And the secretary says, oh, okay, that's fine then. And when the person's handing it back, Jackie grabs it. And for the first, and he's 19, I think, at the time, or 20. For the first time in his life, he sees this piece of paper and it says that he was in a concentration camp. And he just stands there screaming because he can't believe that that this was his past and his parents didn't tell him and all of this. So finally, at that point, he gets his father. He says, Dad, where did you adopt me from? And his dad says, well, it was this orphanage in Lingfield, Surrey. So with his fiance, Jackie gets in the car and he drives down to Lingfield and he sees Weir Courtney. It was there all the time in his dreams. And yet his parents sort of set up this wall so that that would be blocked off for him. It's a like a wonderful story. So I tell the story in the book, but it's really quite typical for children who end up being adopted, that this is just a very difficult wall because their adopted parents can't fill the gaps and they don't know.
Mm. Okay, we're going to just do two more questions. Do you talk about the loss that the families who hid a child felt when they were taken?
Do you let me look at the question. The loss of the way the families, the way the parents felt when they had to give a child up to,
Yes,
into hiding.
when they, yeah, gave up their child to
I
save
It is a
themselves.
great topic, and I don't talk about it much in the book only because the book, for as far as I can, I always try to focus on the children's perspective. So I certainly tell the story of how children feel going into that. But yeah, I see where you're coming from. I mean, I am a mother to two fairly small children. I cannot imagine what mothers and fathers must have gone through when they did that. But it isn't a story I actively tell in this book.
Okay, and for our last question, and again, we will hopefully get back to all of you and thank you. Thank you for your interest. This is from an anonymous attendee, and it's kind of heavy. My parents refused to let me contact the woman who was my mother for almost 2 years. I loved my mother, but I also loved this woman, and I wish I could have had contact with her. My mother reacted hysterically whenever I asked about my caregivers. So it's not a question, it's more of just a
Yeah.
comment, a thought, a feeling. Terrible. Yeah. And I'm
I
sure you've
mean,
encountered a lot of that.
yeah, I'm so sorry to hear that story, but I don't know if it makes you feel better or worse, but it's a very, very typical experience for those who were hidden or for those who had some kind of rescue family during the war. That it wasn't only biological families that tried to cut off that contact, it was also care homes and also adoptive families. And I have this one case in the book of a lovely woman named Paulette who lived with a family in the countryside. She loved her rescue mother so much and didn't realize that it wasn't her real mother. Her parents were murdered, so her parents did not come to reclaim her after the war. But this was in France, and there was a general sense on the part of the Osé and Jewish communities that children who had been placed with Christian rescuers had to be reclaimed for Judaism. So there were actually quite a lot of kidnappings. And at the first when I heard about this, I thought maybe it was, I didn't think, I didn't think it was real at first, but turns out it is really quite real. There was a frequent practice of kidnapping children back. And so this girl, Paulette, she's walking down the road with her beloved rescue mother, and these guys come up in a car and say, and then basically grab her and say, "Don't worry, we're Jewish. We're taking you to live in a Jewish care home." And what she's so angry about, even to this day, is that they never let her say goodbye to the host mother that she loved so much. And that story is told in the book. It really, really stayed with me. That the the forcible ripping apart of those bonds was terrible for children, so painful. And so I'm so sorry to hear that that was also your experience.
Thank you so, so, so much. I'm going to ask the JDC archives and our tech people to keep up the link where you can purchase Rebecca's book. And also, to reassure us that we will do everything we can to answer your questions and maybe put up a link or whatever if to get a hold of Rebecca or archives directly. And thank you all for joining us. And again, if you have a personal story that you want to find more information about, you can do that through jdc.org as well. I would invite you again to be a part of our next webinar featuring the Helen Cohen Memorial Lecture. It'll take place on Yom HaShoah on April 8th. Our speaker will be Avi Pot, who will present his newest book, The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of the Revolt. And that program will be co-sponsored by the Jewish Book Council, and you can register for it via our JDC Archives Facebook page. We hope that you will be able to join us. Wish you all a happy, meaningful, easy fast and Pesach, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, everyone.
And I like your cohort there.
That's my
Thank
son.
you all. Stay well.
Take care. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.